the Carmel Public Library Foundation, and we're very excited about this program tonight with Doug Smith. And if I may even say so, is his mom, Annette, who's here. Wave your hello. And before we begin, I'd like to have our board director, Janice Schultheis, tell you a little bit more about the foundation, and then she'll introduce the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Before I start, I'll just remind everybody to switch your cell phones off. So, for more than a century, the Carmel Public Library has been a treasured cultural center for our community, offering free programs, services, and library collections to more than 112,000 library patrons and visitors every year. This year, the Carmel Public Library Foundation was founded to raise funds to operate the library. Our mission is to keep the library open, relevant, and thriving, and to ensure free library service in perpetuity by providing funding for 100% of books, materials, programs, equipment, and services, all funded by charitable donations from people like you. The Carmel Public Library Foundation, as well as colleagues like Friends of the Library, makes providing all of your library services possible. Your gifts have enduring impact. So a quick word about giving. Please consider making an annual contribution if you haven't already done so. Any amount is appreciated. Contributors who give an annual gift of $100 or more are invited to our library celebration, the Donor Salute, which is held in the spring. It's a special community event, and our way of sharing our appreciation. We hope to see you all at this fun and popular event next spring, because you are the reason our library is open and thriving. Also, please note that this year's fundraiser, the Travel Edition, is featuring acclaimed travel writers Pico Geyer, renowned novelist, and essayist known for his unique cultural commentary, and Don George, editor-at-large and columnist for National Geographic Traveler, and editor of BBC Travel's Worlds and Wanderlust. The program will be held on April 24th, right here at the Sunset Center. It's a great event. We have a wine reception beforehand, and the tickets are on sale at the Sunset Center website. So now for our program. Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs. Douglas Smith is an award-winning historian and translator whose works have been translated into a dozen languages. He has written 5 books on Russia, and his latest book, Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs, was published in November 2016 in the US and the UK. The most complete biography ever written, Rasputin draws on long-lost documents from archives in 7 different countries to overturn many of the old myths about the infamous Russian mystic, presenting him in a fascinating new light. Publishers Weekly calls it monumental and soul-shaking, written in a Dostoevskian flavor for noir and obsession. So now, please welcome Douglas Smith.
New York, and I thought I was doing pretty well. And a few minutes in, I heard a voice in the back I couldn't see yell out, "See that thing in front of your face? It's called a microphone. Use it." I was like, whoa, okay. So I always like to make sure everybody can hear what I've got to say, unless they don't want to listen. It's wonderful to be back here. I was here a few years ago for a previous book that I wrote, and I was telling people up in Seattle where I live that I was off to a book talk, and they said, "Where is it going to be this time?" I said, "Carmel," and obviously their eyes get glassy and they look envious, and I say, well, I know how to pick them, so it's wonderful to be back in this beautiful part of the state, part of the country. I'd like to thank, again, the foundation for supporting this and other talks like this, which are so vital and I think ever more important as we ever get more and more attached to our screens and our devices. It's so good to see people getting out and interacting and talking about books and history and ideas and things. I'd like to thank the Snorfs who support the foundation, and also Tom and Mary McCary who support the foundation and are supporting me, old family friends, and it's great to see them, and my mother who came up from Southern California, the greatest supporter and publicist an author could ask for. And if I make mistakes tonight, we'll discuss them later, I'm sure. No, I'm kidding. Also want to thank Alexandra Fallon for all of her support and help in putting this talk together. And also Pilgrim's Way Books, who are over here and have copies of Rasputin and are here to help out with book sales. I typically like to talk for about 3 hours. And then there's a slight break before the second half. So get comfortable. No, I'm going to talk about 30 minutes or so, and then always happy to take whatever questions and comments people might have. It was a little over a century ago, December 30th, 1916, that one of the most famous, infamous murders of the 20th century took place. If people know anything about Rasputin, it's about the fact that he was impossible to kill. That he had been fed poisoned cakes, that he had been fed poisoned wine, nothing worked. That they had beaten him, nothing worked. That they had shot in him, and it was only when they threw his body into the icy Neva River that he finally succumbed to his wounds. Here is an actual photograph of Rasputin just days after the murder, when his lifeless body had been plucked from the river. In the background is the Krestovsky Bridge from which his body had been thrown. Now we know who the murderers were. It was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest and most prominent of aristocrats in Imperial Russia, his good friend the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of Tsar Nicholas II, and the right-wing politician Vladimir Pushkevich. Now they all had a number of motives for killing Rasputin, but ultimately they liked to think that they were all great Russian patriots. For several years now, Russia had been drifting into chaos after 2 years of horrible fighting in World War I. The war had gone badly for Russia, and the mood became widespread that Russia was not losing the war of its own, but in fact, Russia was being sold out to the Germans by traitors. And at the center of this band of traitors were none other than the Empress Alexandra and her supposed lover, Rasputin. In murdering Rasputin, Yusupov and the others thought that they would save the Tsar and that they would save Russia from ruin. But in fact, just the opposite happened. By killing Rasputin, the murderers, in fact, sped up the forces of disruption and anarchy that were taking control in Russia. They did not save the monarchy, they in fact spelled its doom. And within 3 months after Rasputin's murder, the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 300 years, collapsed. As the famous Russian poet Alexander Blok said, "The bullet that killed Rasputin struck the very heart of the reigning dynasty." Who was Rasputin? As he's called in Russian, Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin is one of the most famous of Russians of all time. Popular culture, not only in Russia, but even more so in the West, is famous for its Rasputins. And you can encounter Rasputin just about anywhere you look, it seems. Here's one. For those of you who were into disco in the 70s, go ahead, raise your hands. There was a German group called Boney M, who was famous for their disco hit Ra-Ra Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. Ra-Ra Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine. You can find this on YouTube. I recommend it. It's actually quite entertaining. Boney M actually made their way to the Soviet Union and performed this on Red Square. I'm not sure what the Russians made of it, but they recorded it. There are other songs less well known than the Boney M hit. One that I managed to find, which took a good deal of research, was from 1933 by an American group from the South called the Three Keys. And they had a song called Rasputin, That Highfalutin Lovin' Man. And I actually found that on CD, which wasn't easy. It tells the story of a crazy lover named Rasputin Jones. And my favorite line in this song goes, "Can't you tell he's from the South? See that gold mine in his mouth?" There are Rasputin bars, Rasputin restaurants, cafes. There's the Rasputin record store up in Berkeley. There's Rasputin vodka, of course, even though he didn't like vodka. And there's Rasputin Imperial Stout, which is actually brewed right here in California. You can find Rasputin comic books. You can find Rasputin in Japanese manga and anime. And if you're more into high culture, there's even a Rasputin opera which you can check out. Obviously, there are a great many Rasputin movies of varying degrees of quality. This is one of the most recent ones, a joint French-Russian story, biopic of the life of Rasputin, starring the French actor Gérard Depardieu, which is probably one of the worst castings of all time. Rasputin was many things, but he was not a lumbering, overweight, broken down, overpaid French actor. He was thin, lithe, quick. People said energy literally flowed through his fingertips. Definitely not like Depardieu tried to do here. And then for those into different sorts of films, there was the 1997 Warner Brothers classic animated film Anastasia, and this is the Rasputin that they gave us in that picture. The story of Rasputin reads like a dark fairy tale. An obscure, uneducated peasant from the wilds of Siberia receives a calling from God and sets out in search of the true faith, a journey that leads him across the vast expanses of Russia for many years before finally bringing him to the palace of the Tsar. The royal family takes him in and is bewitched by his piety, his unerring insights into the human soul, and his simple peasant ways. Miraculously, he saves the life of the heir to the throne, but the presence of this outsider and the influence he wields with the Tsar and the Tsaritsa angers the great men of the realm, and they lure him into a trap and kill him. Many believe that the holy peasant had foreseen his death and prophesied that should anything happen to him, the Tsar would lose his throne. And so he does, and the kingdom he once ruled is plunged into unspeakable bloodletting and misery for years. Now, Rasputin is not one of those figures who has been overlooked by historians and biographers. There is shelf upon shelf of books about the so-called Mad Monk and the Holy Devil. The online catalog of the Library of Congress back in D.C. lists 153 different titles on Rasputin. So one has to ask, do we need 154? I came to the idea of writing about Rasputin somewhat by sheer coincidence, and had never, to be quite honest, been drawn to him as a person of great interest or intrigue. But I wrote an earlier book called Former People, which was the story of what happened to the Russian nobility after the revolution in 1917. And while I was researching that book, I had to read a great deal about the final years of Tsarist Russia, the first 17 years of the 20th century. And everywhere I went, there was Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin seemingly staring me in the face. Every document I looked at, every text I read, letters, memoirs, newspapers, there was Rasputin. And so I started to think about this and wonder, he really was that important. He really was that vital in people's imaginations at the time. And so maybe I should, think about taking a look at him. So I started reading most of the Western biographies that had been written about him, not all of them, but the best ones. And I came away disappointed with what I was encountering. I felt that the treatment of him was often two-dimensional, lacked a certain complexity in trying to really understand who he was as a man, his inner life, his role in politics and at the court, that he was very much this holy devil, mad monk, almost a sort of cartoonish character. And then I noticed that there was a growing interest in contemporary Russia in going back and trying to make sense of Rasputin's life. And there I found something very different. Among the right-wing nationalist groups in Russia, there's an attempt to weed out all the negative things about Rasputin and to, in fact, insist that he was a true saint and, in fact, a martyr of the Russian church and that he should be canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church. So it seemed to me we had these two very divergent notions of who he was as a man. To me, neither of them ultimately convincing. And I decided that, well, maybe there is a reason for that 154th book about Rasputin after all. When I decided to move forward, I realized, though, that it wouldn't be enough simply to read the books in the libraries that have been written about him and regurgitate the same old stories and try to pick out which ones I thought were real or not. That if I was going to do something new and worthwhile, it had to go back to the original archival sources. It had to rely on documents that people had not seen before. And whenever I sort of talk to people, I meet at parties or, you know, my son's soccer game on the sideline or whatever, and I tell them what they do, they always, first of all, they're kind of surprised. And then when I say I have to do a lot of travel, the question they always get is, well, why? Isn't it all on the internet? And no, it's not all on the internet. These documents, these letters, memoirs, memoranda, reports, what have you, are not on the internet, and they're lying in archives in countries all over the place. Now, when I started, I didn't have any idea of just what I was getting myself into, and it did end up taking 6 to 7 years full-time research and writing to track all of the sources I needed to try to make sense of Rasputin. I obviously had to go to Russia, to Moscow and Petersburg. I went to Siberia, where he was from, and there are archives. And then I hit places across Europe, from Berlin to Vienna, Paris, London, Oxford, Cambridge, and then archives here in the United States, especially just up the road piece at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Now, I could go on and on about the kinds of things that I discovered that make what I think is for a much more honest, more interesting, in fact, and more devilishly bizarre story about Rasputin from these documents. But I just wanted to talk about two of them to give you a bit of an idea what it is that I found that I think helps complicate and enrich our understanding of Rasputin. I talked about at the beginning the reasons behind his murder. The belief that was widespread that Rasputin was in fact a spy, that during World War I he was handing over sensitive material, top secret documents to the German High Command. Now this is something that you read about over and over in all the books on Rasputin. Recently some have suggested, well, maybe that really wasn't the case, maybe that's some sort of a myth or exaggeration, but still it gets repeated. And what I noticed is that in all of the books on him, no one, in my opinion, had gone to what would be the logical place to look for the answer to this question, which would be the German archives. So I went to Berlin and spent a week there working in the political archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And sure enough, I found tons of documents on Rasputin in the archive. And I was like, this is perfect. This is exactly the kind of work you have to do to get at some proximity to the truth. And sure enough, they were obsessed with Rasputin in the German High Command during the war because they knew of his place beside Nicholas and Alexandra. They knew of his importance in sort of Russian politics at the time. But what was great was reading all of these reports and documents written by German agents and spies buried in places like Sweden and Norway and Switzerland, was that although they were obsessed with Rasputin, the Germans clearly had never made any contact with him. And they didn't really know whose side he was on. Was he a loyal Russian, or was he willing to sell out his native land? Could he be bribed with money? Could he be bribed with booze? Could he be bribed with women? What would it take to get to him? And they were very obsessed with this question. But what was very clear from reading all the documents was that they never, in fact, did make any contact with him. So we can finally sort of put to rest once and for all this story that has been repeated over and over and was used as the very justification for his murder in 1916. Now, that's how things go when they're going well for you as a biographer or historian. You figure out where the archive is, you ask your spouse, can you handle things for a little while I go away? And then you go away, you're received, you do the work, it goes well, you find what you want, you come home, and life is good. It doesn't always happen like that. I knew that in one of the main archives in Moscow, the State Archive of the Russian Federation, were all of the police files on Rasputin. reams and reams of documents of the Tsarist police who followed Rasputin everywhere, partially to gather information on him and also in an attempt to safeguard his life, which is what Nicholas and Alexander wanted. Now, these archives were basically closed during all of the Soviet period. The Soviets didn't really want anyone delving too deeply into Rasputin. Then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were open for a while, and a couple historians did get a chance to see them, but made only sparing use of them. So I knew they were there, and I knew I had to have them. So I went off to Moscow from my home in Seattle, and I went to the archive, went up to the nice woman there in the reading room, and I filled out my request on paper, which is the way you used to do it, and told her what I wanted, and she said, come back tomorrow, zavtra, come tomorrow, which is what they usually say. And I went back the next day, and I said, hi, I'm here for the police files on Rasputin. And she said, they're with the director. And I said, okay, I'd still like to see them. They're with the director. Fine. When will the director be done with the files? They're with the director. Can I see the director? They're with the director. And this went on for about 5 minutes. I was, okay, they're not going to let me see the director, and the director is not going to let me see the files. Fine. Keep working on other things. I went back a second time to Moscow. Went through the same procedure. I got the exact same response. The files are with the director, and you are not going to see them. So despondent, I left Moscow, and I had to stop over in London, where I was taking part in a literary festival and giving a talk on another thing I was researching. And after the talk, a young woman came up to me and introduced herself, said she'd enjoyed the talk and all that. I immediately noticed that she had a Russian accent, and we were chatting for a bit, and then she said, well, what are you researching now? And I said, well, I'm trying to write a biography of Rasputin, but I don't know if I'll be able to actually do it because I can't get these police files in Moscow that I absolutely have to have. And she said, well, where are they? I said, they're in the State Archive of the Russian Federation. She goes, oh, well, the director's my godfather. I fell to my knees. I kissed her feet. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. Sergei Mironenko is your godfather. She's like, oh, yeah, I grew up with him. I'll just shoot him an email. When do you think you'll be there again? So this is sometimes how things work. And sure enough, she sent an email to her godfather, and I got myself back to Moscow. This time I was shown directly to the director's office, and there on one of his side tables were files that went up like this. And I'm like, oh my God, the mother lode. And I'm just sitting there, and he just wanted to talk and talk. And I'm like, but could we, and after a while, he said, okay, I'm going to let you see the files, but you only get 2 days, and no photocopying and no use of your smartphone camera. And I was like, all right, I'll do what I can. So for 2 days, I sat in my chair, and I typed as fast as I could, and I turned page after page. And it's worth it. You have to do this hard, often very maddening and boring work because you find these nuggets that are the gold that every biographer, historian looks for. One of the most famous stories in the life of Rasputin happened in March of 1915, when he took a train from Petrograd, as Petersburg was called then, to Moscow. And he was there for several days. And the story goes that while he was there, he went with some friends to a place called the Yar restaurant. And while he was there that night, he got completely drunk, blind drunk out of his mind. He started harassing the girls in the gypsy chorus. He started bothering the other patrons, trying to have a nice, quiet dinner. When someone said, I'm not even sure that that's Rasputin, who is this lout in here causing all this trouble? He is said to have jumped up on the table, dropped his trousers, exposed himself, and said, this is the altar at which the Empress prays. Huge scandal. Police are called. A snarling, drunken Rasputin is dragged out of the restaurant, thrown into prison. All of Russia is convulsed by this scandal that shows both the depravity of Rasputin and the moral blindness of the royal couple that they allow such a creature as this to be permitted to court. Now, this is, again, a story that's repeated over and over and over and over. And I thought, okay, maybe. So I'm going through these documents as fast as I can, and all of a sudden, boom, I get to March 1915. And I go, the Yar incident. And sure enough, there are all these little pieces of paper, often in this sort of purple sort of ink, these field reports from all the various police agents following Rasputin around. They follow him when he leaves Petrograd. They follow him after he arrives in Moscow. He's going here, he's going there, he's seeing that person. He gets into this car. They even have the license plate number of the car he gets into. And sure enough, he goes to the Yar restaurant. So now I'm getting really interested. Goes to the Yar restaurant, and then the police write, Rasputin went to the Yar, dined, home by 1 a.m. End, period. No drunkenness, no scandal, no nothing. And I'm like, well, wait, there's something wrong here. Clearly there's something wrong. And then I keep reading, and about a month or two later into the reports, the head of the police department, a man who hates Rasputin and wants to destroy him up in the capital in Petrograd, writes to his underlings down in Moscow and says, how come you haven't told me anything about that notorious incident of Rasputin at the Yar restaurant? Now, a Russian official knows exactly what is being asked of him at that point. And they begin then on official paper to document a fake incident, and you can see it. And they create an incident that never happened. They send it back to the chief of police in Petrograd, and he writes back, basically says, this isn't good enough. I want more. So they sort of sexy it up even more. You know, they add more lurid details here and there, send it all back to the chief of police in Petrograd, and then he, this man, his name is Junkovsky, requests an audience with the Tsar and goes to Nicholas and says, Your Majesty, it is only with the heaviest of hearts that I must present this dossier to you. You need to know what kinds of things your friend Rasputin is up to in Moscow, and gives him this report, a report that is a complete and utter fabrication. This is, again, the kind of thing that makes you live to do this sort of work. But here's the sticking thing. You think you've got it figured out, and then all of a sudden you realize there's a problem. Because there was a British diplomat based in Moscow at the time, a man by the name of Bruce Lockhart, who in his memoirs, published I think in the 30s or 40s in England, claimed that he had been at the Yar restaurant that night and he saw the scandal with his own eyes. So as a historian, you're left with a dilemma. Do I ignore the Lockhart memoirs? Hope no one bothers to look at it? And thinks, well, Smith didn't do his research? Or do you try to dig even further and figure out, is Lockhart maybe not being completely honest here? So I went that route and started looking around. And, you know, memoirs are tricky things, especially if they've already been published, right? You know, people tend to write about their past in ways that are maybe less than completely 100% accurate. And sure enough, I found that Lockhart had kept diaries, and that these diaries were in the Palace of Westminster in London, and made an appointment to go there, and was shown into a little room upstairs, and out they brought Lockhart's diaries, including his diaries for 1915. And immediately, I go right to March 1915, and I look, and he writes about how he's in Kiev, not Moscow. And there's no mention of the Yar restaurant, and there's no mention of any scandal, and there isn't even any mention of Rasputin. So clearly he wasn't even there, and simply went along with the great story. Again, I think he was maybe a bit down on his luck and needed something juicy to put in the memoir, and those things sell. So anyway, these are the kinds of things that I think I've helped to bring out through all these years of research. Something else I like to do, not just go to the libraries and the archives, is to travel to the places that are sort of connected with my subject's life. I obviously had to go to Siberia, to western Siberia, and visit Rasputin's home village called Pokrovskaya. Here I am in Pokrovskaya. I'm not always sure what it gives me in visiting some of these places, other than just kind of a way to visualize when I'm back home writing what it might have been like when Rasputin was walking down the street, or what the sky looks like, or something like that. But I think it does in some way creep in and inform your understanding of your subject and the way that you end up writing about things and stressing one thing maybe over another. I also had to go because I had to go to see the one and only Rasputin Museum, the only one in the world so far. I went to the museum, which was founded by a husband and wife out in Siberia. They're total Rasputin fanatics. I wasn't sure what to expect. I made sure I didn't say anything too negative about their hero. But they graciously had me in, and they said, "Do you recognize this chair here?" I said, "No, I don't. What are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, you need to sit in this chair. It had been in Rasputin's home." I said, "Wow, and this museum is right across from where his home used to be." And so I sat down. I said, "This is very nice." I didn't know what really to make of it. And they said, This will guarantee you lifelong virility." On through Rasputin. I'm not sure if it's working, but I don't know. I went to Petersburg and visited the sites where he lived when he was in the capital. This was the last building and most famous one he lived in at 64 Gorokhovaya. I waited around to try to get back into the courtyard to get to the interior staircase that would take me to his apartment. And eventually somebody came out. It's interesting. They don't have the blue plaques like they do in London of the famous who've lived in these places. But that red and white sign, you can't make it out, but it's the sign for the Rasputin hair salon, which is right there. So I made my way in, and I knew which staircase, I knew which apartment, so I made my way up, and there, sure enough, was the door to Rasputin's apartment, the very last apartment he lived in. And it was from this apartment that Prince Yusupov came and picked him up that fateful night in December of 1916, from which he would never return. I rang. It took a while, built up my courage. I rang, but nobody came. I have since been put in touch with the man who bought this apartment, who is trying to strip away all the paint and wallpaper of later redecorating and remodeling and bring it down to what he hopes is the way it might have looked when Rasputin lived there, and create some sort of a memorial museum out of Rasputin's last apartment. Of course, I had to go to the cellar of the Yusupov Palace where the murder happened. I'm the one on the right. It was down in the cellar where the murder took place. It's very kitschy now. They've got the wax figures of Rasputin and Yusupov with the supposed poison cakes and poison wine and things like that. And then I went out into the courtyard next door. This is on the side of the Yusupov Palace. And it was through that door that Rasputin apparently did try to make his escape and get away from his killers, because there were blood drops that came out of the door and through the snow that night that the police later photographed when they came to investigate the murder site. And what's interesting is this courtyard here that I'm standing in is now a playground for a small kindergarten. And it was so incongruous to see these cute little kids laughing and playing on their slides and swings and things like that, knowing that that was the exact spot where Rasputin's life came to end. I went outside Petersburg to Tsarskoye Selo, where the Tsars had one of their palaces. And it was out here that Rasputin was first buried after his murder and the discovery of his body. And some local Rasputin fans think that they found the spot where that original grave was, and they put up this memorial to him right there. And when I came upon him, there was a woman weeping just terribly. There she is in red, and she was just weeping and praying and sobbing, and I went up to her to ask, if there was something I could do, if she was all right, and she kept just saying, nash grech, which is our sin, our sin. She kept going, the sin we as Russians have for the life of Rasputin and for the life of the Romanov family, and it was both sad and touching and a bit eerie. I felt bad. I didn't mention to her that this is actually, in fact, probably not where the grave had been, but in fact was in a field further on. Later, a group of local historians did a bit more research, and it was most likely out here that he was originally buried in a church that was being built by Anna Vyrubova, one of the other close friends of Nicholas and Alexandra. And I spent some time walking around out in the field. It was kind of atmospheric. Of course, I didn't find anything. I'm sure people were wondering what this man was doing wandering around in the field looking, but again, I think it's important, if you can, to sort of visit these places. Here's a famous photograph of Rasputin with members of the royal family in the palace. Obviously, there he is in the middle. Next to him, to the left, is the Empress Alexandra. On the bottom row, left to right, you have Grand Duchess Maria, Grand Duchess Tatiana, and one of their nursemaids, Maria Vishnyakova. In the middle is Anastasia, as we call her, Alexei, the Tsarevich, the heir to the throne, and then in the back is the Grand Duchess Olga, the eldest of the children. So what did these 6 years or so add up to? What is new? What is in this Rasputin that maybe isn't in the others? If nothing else, I hope that I've moved us forward from the sort of facile dichotomy, distinction of holy devil, of the mad monk, that he was neither the devil nor the saint. I've tried not to sort of whitewash his less positive traits. He clearly drank, and drank a lot, especially in his later years. He definitely womanized. He was a lech and a groper. Women who sat down on a sofa next to him were never really left alone. He had a temper, and he could rage with anger, even in front of the emperor, in front of Nicholas. He would pound the table if he felt like the Tsar wasn't listening to him. He was vain in certain ways, and he definitely was an incredibly ambitious man. You don't go from being a humble peasant in Siberia to being the so-called friend of the Emperor and Empress of Russia without a definite drive to get there. But there were these other things that were less negative, that had often either been glossed over or had been presented, I thought, unfairly and inaccurately. One thing was, he was not at all greedy. He was not motivated by money or riches. And in fact, when in the later years people were always coming to him and trying to bribe him for favors with Nicholas and Alexandra, no sooner would they put money into his hands than he would turn around and give that money to somebody who needed it more than he did. So there was no desire for riches, for land, for palaces, for titles, or anything like that. He was very much someone who wanted to remain connected to the peasant class and the area from which he came. And in fact, he never severed his roots to Siberia. He always would go back many times a year to his home village of Pokrovskaya, where his wife lived. In his own sort of way, he was even, I would say, a good family man. He had 3 children with his wife Praskovia, daughters Maria and Varvara. He was adamant that they would get the best possible education, which was fairly uncommon for a peasant at the time, and he brought them to Petersburg and enrolled them in the best schools that he could. He worried about their dating. He would question them when they were going out with some young man, and he even would try to hook them up with what he thought would be the most appropriate suitors for them. He had a son, Dmitri, who was drafted into World War I, and Rasputin was devastated at the thought that he would be killed in the war, and in this instance did use his political clout to see that Dmitri was not sent off to the front lines, but was put away in a safer spot. I also came away convinced that he truly was a man who believed in the Bible and believed in the Gospels. Now, one of the ideas about Rasputin is that this was all a scam, that he simply used religion as a tool to advance himself for his own particular nefarious ends. And I think this is definitely not the case. He truly knew the Bible. He knew it very well. He had his own way of interpreting it, no doubt. But he truly was, in many ways, I would say, an example of some of the best teachings in Christianity. And I'll just give you one example. In the summer of 1914, Rasputin was back in Pokrovskaya, and he was walking down his home street when a woman came up to him, and she had a black veil over her face and had a sort of a strange costume on. And he immediately assumed that she was a beggar. And he was always giving to beggars. He believed in almsgiving, that you should always give to someone who has less than you do. So he reached into his pocket to pull out some coins to give to her. And at that moment, she pulled out a knife about that long and plunged it directly into his stomach, screaming, "I've killed the Antichrist," and then began chasing him down the street as he was trying to pull this knife out of his stomach. Amazingly, he survived, was brought to hospital, survived, but at the same time this was happening, Europe was heading straight into World War I. And Rasputin, from his hospital bed in Siberia, was sending telegrams to the Tsar, "Don't go to war, avoid war at all costs." And when he realized that the Tsar was not listening to him, he actually wrote the Tsar a handwritten letter. And this letter is truly prophetic. It amazingly made its way out of the country and now can be read at the Beinecke Rare Book Room at Yale University. But in it, he goes on and on about God's teaching that God said, "Thou shalt not kill," that this was wrong. It was wrong to go to war. It was wrong to shed blood for all sorts of reasons, especially it goes against what we were taught as Orthodox Christians to believe. And then he also went on to say, and even if that isn't enough, if you go to war, I see nothing but unending seas of blood and darkness and chaos for Russia. And of this, of course, he was very much truthful and very much correct. I also came away with an inversion of how we think about some of the perversity and moral corruption surrounding the life of Rasputin. The traditional story is a corrupt, depraved peasant makes his way to the glittering capital of Russia, St. Petersburg, and there corrupts all of society. I came away with a completely reversed picture of it. It was, in fact, St. Petersburg that in many ways corrupted Rasputin and not the other way around. And I think we can see this in the final chapter of his life, in the murder of Rasputin. It was in fact elite society that was willing to commit a cold-blooded murder of an innocent man for all sorts of bizarre reasons that if one had stopped to really think about would have made no sense. Our source for what happened that night in the Yusupov Palace comes chiefly just from the memoirs of Yusupov. And I've always found it interesting that we for so long have taken the words of a killer as the truth. And if you read his memoirs closely, there's only about one or two places where Yusupov is honest in that book, and that is where he calls what he did that night a cowardly crime. And in this book, Yusupov tries to depict himself as the man who is going to save Russia. That he is, in a sense, the Archangel Michael doing battle against Satan's forces in the book of Revelation. And this is where he then turns Rasputin into Satan himself, which then means a man of equally superhuman strength, Prince Yusupov, is the only one capable of murdering him. Now in the book, I try to take all this apart and get at the truth of what I think really happened that night in December of 1916. But to get that answer, you'll have to read the book. Thank you.
Yeah, the question is, what happened to Rasputin's body after he was killed? And again, it's one of these, it was really, one of the things that was so hard about writing this book is like, everything is shrouded in legend and myth and lie, and you read one book and it'll say X, you read another book and it'll say X is wrong, and it's so trying to get at the truth is hard, and that also relates to the story of what happened to his body. So we do know for a fact that Alexander, the empress, decided that Rasputin was going to be buried at Tsarskoye Selo, at the Tsar's palace, just outside the park, actually, so not technically on the park grounds. Which is interesting. She didn't let anyone in Rasputin's family decide where he was going to be buried. She didn't ask Rasputin's widow or any of the children. And he was buried in a chapel that was being built by Anna Vyrubova, who was the closest friend of the empress. But then soon after, you have the February Revolution, where the monarchy falls. And soon after that, the new provisional government decides we are going to find and dig up Rasputin's body, because we don't want it to become a pilgrimage site for supporters of the old regime. And they eventually find where the body is, they dig up the body, they surreptitiously load it into a truck, and then put it on a train, and they bring it back into Petrograd, into the capital, late at night. Early the next morning, it's loaded onto a truck with a bunch of soldiers and is driven north out of the city. That all we know for fact. Everything that happens after that, we don't really know. The earliest story was that they were driving the body out to dispose of it. They got stuck in the snow. So there was some woods, so they took the body, they dragged it off into the woods, built a bonfire, and burned the body there. It's not that easy to burn a body, especially in the middle of the winter, and to dispose of it that completely. So years later, some of the others who were involved in handling the body said, we never got to the woods. In fact, we stopped. It was it was a Polytechnic Institute that had huge incinerators, and they just put the body in one of the incinerators, and that was it. I think the earlier stories sounded more romantic. You know, they sort of spread his ashes to the wind, and be gone, Rasputin. And blow off the face of the earth. Whereas just being chucked in a giant, foundry incinerator is not as romantic. But yeah, that's probably what happened. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and the other thing is what happened to his daughter. I understand she died in Los Angeles.
She died in Silver Lake, in fact. Yeah. So he had 3 children. Dmitri, his son, married and stayed in Russia with his mother, Praskovia, Rasputin's widow. They had a very hard life. They were repressed repeatedly by the Soviet government, forced out of their home and things like that. Eventually, Dmitri and his wife and Dmitri's mother, Rasputin's widow, were forced into basically a gulag camp where they basically all perished. The other daughter, Varvara, died in Moscow in the early 20s under somewhat mysterious circumstances. But then Maria did manage to escape to the West. Her story is really amazing, and she's written several memoirs. She's obviously now long since dead, but she ended up making her way across the Far East to Europe, where she went into the circus. And it was a nightclub performer. She'd do the dance of Rasputin's daughter kind of thing. And then she went and worked in the circus here in the U.S. Until an awful accident in Peru, Indiana, where she was becoming an animal trainer, animal circus performer, and was mauled by a bear in a training session, ended up in the hospital. Made her way to Los Angeles, to Silver Lake, and lived out the rest of her life there, writing memoirs and things like that. Yeah, exactly. And you can go to her grave. I actually went to her grave, which is in Venice Boulevard in Koreatown. If you're into that kind of thing. Yeah.
Are there any hypotheses how we managed to stop the hemophilia for that limited period of time for Nikolai?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. The question is, was Rasputin really able to heal the heir to the throne, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia? And that was something I really, really struggled with, trying to make sense of, and how I was going to talk about this. Obviously, we know the boy suffered. He had bleeding episodes. There was a time in 1912 where it seemed that he was going to die from it. And he never did die, obviously, until he was murdered along with the rest of his family after the revolution. After a lot of, I could go on all night like this, and I don't want to bore you with it. But I think the answer to whatever influence Rasputin had on the boy's health, obviously he never cured him of hemophilia. He had that until he died. But he didn't die while Rasputin was around. That is true. And I think if there was any influence that he had on it, it has to do in the mind-body connection, which are things that we're only now really starting to explore. The degree to which mental states, emotional states, can control the human body and physical processes. And I think there's a great book by a British journalist who writes on medical affairs called Cure. It's all about this. Like UCLA now has a mind-body institute, I think Harvard does. I think it was a form of placebo effect, where Rasputin's charisma convinced Alexandra that he would be all right. And Alexandra believed this, and she then helped impart this into her son, which I think helped possibly lower the blood pressure, lower the pulse, which allowed the body to heal and the blood to coagulate. Rasputin also did always say, get the doctors away from him. And that was good advice, because they were constantly poking and prodding, which only prolonged the bleeding episodes.
Yeah.
I talk about it at length, but I think ultimately that's the direction that we'd have to go for some sort of explanation. Yes?
This was a very tumultuous time in Russia. We had the Marxism and the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks and the First World War and the extraction of Russia from the war and all this. Is Rasputin, did he really, was he the influence that brought down the Romanovs, or was he just a sort of a colorful hood on this revolution?
That's a good expression. I wish I'd thought of that myself. That's a good, yeah. I come away thinking that his actual influence behind the scenes was quite limited. But that's not to say he wasn't influential. He was hugely influential. But it wasn't what Rasputin was doing, it's what everyone thought he was doing. When I started this book, I thought, oh, there's so much myth, there's so much gossip and legend, I've got to strip all that away and get down to what really happened. And I soon realized that as I was doing this work, if I did that, I'd miss 60% of the story. Because what was crucial to him and his influence, which was enormous, was that everyone was convinced he was so powerful. And by assuming he had such powers, they had a whole way of interpreting the state of the government, the state of their society, the mental health of Nicholas, the emotional stability of the Empress, and all sorts of things like that. He became this powerful symbol of what was wrong with Russia. And at the same time, he became, especially for those on the political left, he became a very convenient political tool with which to beat the regime. That Rasputin is, so bad, and this is a symbol of how morally decrepit and decayed and rotten the imperial system is, and we need to get rid of it. But most of all of these were lies that were told about him simply as a way to tarnish the image of the throne and help bring it down. But that does not say he didn't try to influence the Tsar. I mean, one example I gave you was times of good advice, like the summer of 1914. Don't go to war. And that's one of those great what-if moments. What if Nicholas had listened to Rasputin and not gone to war? Obviously, the trajectory of Russian history, world history, would have been very different. Yeah.
How did you yourself come to embrace and fall in love with all things Russian?
Oh, where does my Russian love come from? It's funny, it starts with Hogans Heroes, which is kind of weird. Many people maybe don't know the reference, but it was this really awful but wonderful sitcom in the 60s, and 70s, early 70s. I fell in love with Hogans Heroes, which made me want to learn German. So I learned German, I went off to college doing a German major, and one of my German professors said, have you thought about taking Russian too? And I said, I have no interest. And he insisted, so I started Russian basically from the very beginning in college, and I fell in love with Russia through learning the language. And there was something about the language, and it was still the Cold War, and the sort of exotic notion of the Soviet Union. And I started to go there to study, and I later worked for the State Department there, and it's a fascinating place, and I have wonderful people, I have wonderful friends, and it's, I don't know, people sometimes refer to getting the Russian bug, and I got it big, and I just decided to go with it. Yes?
The mind-body connection fascinates me, and I had a theory in my head years ago. Did he study hypnosis? Do you know?
That's one of the things that people have suggested, that he was an expert in hypnosis. The only bit of actual primary documentation that we have about any possible connection was, again, in these police documents I referred to in Moscow. There was a kind of shady hypnotist who met with Rasputin on one or two occasions. And the police followed up on this and explored the connection. But we don't know, was Rasputin meaning to learn from him about hypnosis, or was this shady hypnotist trying to learn Rasputin's secrets for controlling people? I don't think that he was a hypnotist. There are movies that you'll have him and he's hypnotizing the little boy and that kind of thing. I don't think there's any truth in that. I think we have to admit, even people who were his enemies had to admit there was this rare charisma to the man and a rare energy that seemed to pulsate. And I think that is crucial to understanding what sort of influence he might have had on the young boy. But I don't believe he was actually practicing hypnotism. Yes?
How did he make his way from a peasant
Yeah, how'd you go from being
And was he the lover of the
Oh, well, first of all, no. Although that was always written about. And this was, again, the way he was used as a tool to bash the regime, right? There were all these horrific stories being peddled that he was Alexandra's lover, and there was even talk of menage a trois with her friend Anna. There was all sorts of lurid stories, even that he was sleeping with the daughters of the empress. None of that is true. This was all lies made up by his enemies. The way he reaches the palace is really remarkable. And again, if it hadn't really happened, and you put it in a work of fiction, people would say, this is an awful book, this simply couldn't happen. He started out life like every other peasant male where he lived, born in 1869, where you worked the land and you fished the lakes and the rivers, and you married young and had children, and you went to church and you celebrated the feasts and things like that. At some point, he had a religious experience. He had some sort of vision, some sort of conversion, if you will. And he became what the Russians call a strannik, which is a holy pilgrim. And there were thousands and thousands of these people in Russia in the late 19th, early 20th century. These were people who would leave home, leave their families, leave their villages, and they would travel typically on foot all throughout the year from monastery to monastery, church to church, in search of spiritual enlightenment. And they would go with only what they could carry. After traveling for months and months, sometimes years and years, their clothes were reduced to rags. They survived only on alms and food that people would give to them. And he became one of these holy pilgrims, one of these straniki, and he did it for several years. And this was, if you will, his university. This is where he saw the great breadth of Russian society. He moved with criminals, he moved with the lowliest elements, he moved among priests and prelates, he even interacted with members of the higher classes. And he learned rudimentary reading and writing, and he learned scripture, and he learned it practically by heart. And he could recite scripture and imbue it with the sort of folk peasant language that sort of brought it alive and made it seem realer than what those dry, formally trained priests were talking about when they talked about God. And there was a fascination among elite Russia at the time with these holy men of the people. That this was where the true spiritual life of Russia resided. Not with the westernized elites of Moscow and Petersburg, but that the simple folk, the simple people, were the true Russians, where the true flame of Russian spirituality dwelled. And these people were sought out, and they sought out people like Rasputin, and he was founded. So he was a combination of both his own inherent experience, personality, knowledge, and insight, and a popular fascination, and they came together to bring him forward to the palace, because Nicholas and Alexandra were also very interested in figures like this and wanted to meet them. They felt like by meeting Rasputin, they were sitting face to face with the millions of people who lived out in the great stretches of Russia. Oh, back here, yeah.
So you said he was poisoned many times, poisoned and shot, and they couldn't kill him, right? Well, how do you explain that?
Oh, okay, yeah. What? Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, again, that's in the book, but no. Just teasing. So the story is, yes, as Yusupov tells it in his memoirs, that yeah, they gave him the cyanide, and they put it in cakes, then they put it in wine, and it didn't work. The question is, was it cyanide? We don't know. The one person who was supposedly going to give the killers the poison later wrote that, he thought, I'm not going to get involved in this. So he gave him crushed up aspirin. So there's a possibility that he was just being fed aspirin. So obviously it had no effect. The thought that he was beaten to death, his body after it was pulled from the river, and actually that's a good question you asked me. I forgot, I had one more slide. Has everyone eaten? No! This is one of the autopsy photographs that's in an autopsy book in a museum in Petersburg that shows what Rasputin's body looked like after they pulled him out of the river. And it was obviously very damaged, but was that because he had been beaten? Or was it the effect of being crushed under the ice for several days and frozen? And then when they pulled him out, they had to chip the body out of the ice, further damaging it. But I don't think any of that probably really happened. The autopsy showed that he had been shot 3 times. Twice in the torso, and a 3rd time. And if you look closely, you can see where that 3rd bullet shot came from. The Russians call that the kontrolny vysтрел, the control shot, directly in the forehead, right there in the forehead. So basically, I think what probably happened, they had him down in the basement. Possible they gave him what they thought was, poison, but it wasn't. They shot him once. He bolted through that door, which is up a half flight of stairs, tried to run across the courtyard. They probably shot him again in the back. He fell. Then they approached him one last time and put the bullet there.
I
Yes.
even heard that they tied the rocks to his body to make sure that he goes down to the river after they shot him.
Well, yeah, they wrapped him in a large bit of curtain, and then they drove to the Krestovsky Bridge. And they bungled this terribly, and they had prepared. We had to weigh the body down, but apparently they kind of wrapped him a bit, and then they threw the body in the river, and then they turned back to the car, and that's where all the weights were. So they grabbed the weights, threw them in the river. Didn't do much good, but I don't want to leave you on this for too long. Yeah, maybe we have time for one more question. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question who wants to? Okay, you have one more.
In all of your research, when you described the religious event to me, I wondered, did anyone do any speculation on whether or not he was simply a charismatic schizophrenic?
Yeah, people have asked me, is there a medical condition that we can give to him?
Yeah.
I'm not a medical doctor, and I didn't try to go down the sort of psychobiographical approach about, was he manic, depressive, was he schizophrenic, or something like that. I think there's a place for that 155th book, which would maybe be trying to, approach his life and understand him from that side. I was interested, obviously, in trying to understand him as a concrete individual, but I think what's so fascinating is Rasputin only works and only makes sense at that time and place. It's Russia at that time that makes a Rasputin possible, and makes this epic story so ultimately fascinating, I think. Anyway, thank you very much.
As we mentioned, the book Rasputin is for sale right over here by Pilgrim's Way Bookstore if you are as fascinated as I am with the subject matter. So thank you for coming.